and pulls up and goes, gets out, slams the door, walks in, looks up, and he goes, she's right, it's stupid. Put some clothes on him. Gets back out, gets in his car, and leaves.
Okay.
I think I would be gilding the lily to say that I had an approach to directing anything when I did this picture. I mean, I'm still just learning. I mean, there's always, no matter what mistake you make, and you say, well, I won't make that mistake again, then you make your next picture, and there's another mistake you can make that you didn't make before. In the case of Dee, who was really gorgeous, I mean, just like a knockout, she was so nice and approachable. There was no difficulty to directing her because she did take direction. The only difficulty for me was that once she would get to a place, sometimes it would be hard for her to get away from that place. Once she had reached that emotional peak, it wasn't like, okay, now we're gonna do a comedy scene. You know, it would be, she would really still be there.
You know, there's no confusion. She's not confusing me for the character once the scene's over, but while we're working together, she is definitely reacting to me.
I saw you die.
I really hadn't figured out quite yet how to be the character and then not be the character when they said cut. And so I sort of kind of was her for 6 weeks.
She was able to just be frightened by anything. There's a scene where she dreams she's being attacked. So the camera had to do a rape scene where the camera is the perpetrator. You know, she would scream on the bed and we would take the camera and just sort of like lunge at her. After that, anytime she saw that camera, she screamed. I mean, it was just built into her.
You have to screw around with your mind a lot. It takes a huge amount of energy, at least the way I work, to cross that line where you're going, this is what I think I ought to do in this scene, and this is how I'm going to act it out, and go, okay, I'm just going to be there. This guy's really going to turn into a werewolf.
In the emotional scenes, and the scenes where she had to be frightened or emotional in any way, she really got into it, and she really worked herself up into a state, but it's very effective.
She really gives the film its reality. Otherwise, it would spin off into, I think, too much silliness.
I don't remember Robert. I only remember Eddie. I remember Robert being Robert and talking to Robert and thinking what a nice man he was. But when you asked me to remember that scene, I only remember Eddie. Weird, huh?
I think it was just natural for her to be the character that she played. And I remember her saying that at night she dreamed about werewolves, that she totally lived it all the time. And if we took out the handheld camera, the Eclair that we did the rape attack with her, I mean, she just screamed. And we'd go on the set, she says, that camera isn't here, is it? And I said, no, we put it away. Because she would use all that. And she just lived, she lived as if this thing was really happening to her.
And this kind of movie, there were a lot of those emotional peaks and a lot of moments of high tension and stuff. And so as a result, I think it was pretty exhausting for her. And then, you know, she did Cujo, which must have been really tough because, I mean, every day you go into that car with that big dog and that kid and you're like hysterical. I mean, it must have been really difficult. But I loved her.
Make you believe.
That's my real scream. They were going to dub in some kind of special effect, and I said, oh, let me have a shot at it.
The end of the film was not written the way it is. As I remember it, she is supposed to transform into a pretty horrible werewolf. She didn't want to be remembered by the audience that way, so she had to be a cute one.
I had it in my contract, you know, that I would not be seen as a werewolf.
She was very, very nervous about having to turn into a werewolf.
You know, I said I really feel like she should be vulnerable in losing her fight. And that's how they came out, what I think looks like a Bambi werewolf.
That was shot the day before the picture was printed, the day before the prints were made.
We ended up having to shoot it in our office, I think, in our production office. It was after, You know, we had John Hora come with the camera, and it was just him, and he lit it, and it was like it's like a tight close-up like this, and we shot it against the wall in our office.
That whole scene is done in huge close-ups because of the fact that there was no set.
It needed to be more of an emotional thing anyway, so the less seen, the better.
Switch, damn it!
The general technique for doing transformations prior to this movie was lap dissolves, where Lon Chaney would be sitting in a chair like this, and they would sort of pin him down so that he couldn't move, and they would change the makeup over a period of, you know, hours and, you know, maybe half a day. And they would then dissolve all these pictures, all these things together in the editing, and that would turn him into a werewolf.
We wanted to do, you know, something that people had not seen before, which is actually see the physical transformation happen.
Which was the thing that got the picture made, and which we had told Afghan Embassy that we were going to do the first transformation scene with no cutaways, and it was going to all be done on camera.
As far as whether or not I was warned about what I was in for, the transformation scene was written out to a certain extent in the script. And I'd heard rumors about what was new about this makeup, the sort of bladder effect, that they glued little airbags to your skin and then basically put a copy of your own skin, in other words, a latex mask that had been molded on your own face, over the little bags. Well, I didn't know that the bags would be condoms. You know, new ones, but, you know, condoms that had been glued here, and a giant, like, rubber, it was like a hot water bottle that was glued to my neck. So I didn't know that when I was inflated by the 8 assistants off camera who were just blowing on tubes and my cheek would go like that. Well, whenever they blew the tube that went into the bladder on my neck, it would completely close my throat and I couldn't breathe. No one can warn you about that because they don't know that's what's going to happen. You're doing something that's new, and they don't know what's really bad about it until you actually have it on, and then you tell them what's really bad about it.
However, I remember visiting the completion bond guy who was going to fund the picture, and if it went over, and him saying, "Now you guys are going to make this picture with like this one werewolf transformation, right?" I said, "Yeah." He says, "What if you can't do it?" And I realized that now, that if I had said, "Well, we're just going to do it," that he wouldn't have funded the picture. But luckily, I was smart enough to say, "Well, you know, we'll have to find another way to do it if it doesn't work." And he said, "That's exactly what I wanted to hear."
The look, the design of the werewolves in this movie was lifted directly out of the research that we did. There were old woodcuts. There were, you know, like 16th century woodcuts that showed this creature, this wolf-like creature with a long snout and the big ears, but standing on its hind legs.
So when it came time to try to figure out how to do it, Rick Baker, who worked on the picture initially, came up with these kind of masks that would elongate. The only reason Rick was doing our picture was because John Landis and he had been planning for a long time, supposedly, to do a picture called American Werewolf in London, and John had never actually done it. And when we took Rick out to lunch to ask him to do our picture, he said, "Well, you know, I really was going to do John's picture, but, you know, it hasn't happened. So, and I really want to do a werewolf thing, and I want to use these techniques, and so I'll do your picture." Well, once John heard of this, by golly, that picture was on the boards and ready to go in just a couple of months. And so Rick said, "Well, I have to do John's movie now." But I'd recommend this guy, Rob Bottin, who is sort of a protege.
His special effects are so much better than American Werewolves in London. They are. I don't think it's because I'm starring in the film. You know.
In order to make these life mask things, you have to have your face encased in plaster. And it gets real hot in there. And if you're claustrophobic, it can drive you crazy. And you have to have a tremendous amount of patience because it takes a long time to put these makeups on.
There's a certain challenge and a certain freedom in acting in a mask. There's an abandon that you can have because it isn't your own face, and there's something about having all that makeup on you that can be freeing. It can encourage you to really go full out.
And I remember when we had the dailies for the first of Rob Bottin's successful effects, that there were ladies at AFCO that couldn't stay in the screening room. You know, they left because it was too intense.
One day, in fact, we actually didn't shoot any film because it was the first day that Rob was going to do the transformation, which started with Bob and ended with puppet heads. And they went upstairs to the makeup room, and Didn't come down. Lunchtime came and went. Dinner time came and went. Haven't shot anything. No, it's not quite ready yet. Then he's finally ready. He comes down. He looks great, but unfortunately, everybody's got to go home because it's too late, and they're all on super golden overtime, even though it's a non-union movie. And we had to wait until the next day.
If he had a werewolf whose snout would extend, that pretty well was what that creature did. So one of the things we would do is, for example, always make sure the camera was moving, because he wasn't on a physical body that could move around. What we did when we actually filmed it was change the speeds during the shot. So the shot might start at 24 frames per second, which is normal speed, and as the action is progressing, we would maybe drop to 12 and speed it way up so it had an uncanny fastness about it, or as it drooled, we might go at a high speed, slow it down in slow motion, so the saliva would drool slower.
We experimented with so many different kind of frame rates, partly because once we added sound to it, then things that were mistakes, where something that was supposed to go smoothly suddenly popped, or if you put a bone crack on it, it looked like it was on purpose. And so, and in fact, it was better than having it just go smoothly.
And a lot of these things, we would go to the point they would break, because the rubber had a limit, but nobody knew where it was till you broke it.
It was really a process of discovery for all of us. And as I said, I would probably edit the sequence a little differently now than it is, because there was a lot of pressure from the company to make that scene be really long. But, all told, I think it's still pretty good. Pete Coran was a friend of ours who actually did the opening title with the howling with the window that breaks and stuff, which was done for the trailer. And we all liked it so much we put it in the movie and never paid him extra, which he never lets us forget. When it came time to do the werewolf transformations during the love scene, it was quite apparent that we weren't going to be able to afford to do that in any other way than animation. And so Pete did some work on glass, which suggests, a little more obviously than I would have liked, that they've actually turned into wolves. And it works okay. I mean, he did a good job with what he had to work with. It's again, another case of there's no other animation like that in the movie, so it's sort of like, oh, what's that? One thing people probably don't know about this picture is that when we first shot it, we only had so much money, and when Rob Bottin didn't have a lot of money, I think he only had $50,000 to build all the werewolf stuff. So basically what he built is he built hands, and he built werewolf heads, and they look great, but they only went to here. So anytime anybody wanted to be menaced by a werewolf, and there are some stills, I think, of a scene on the phone where Belinda is supposedly killed by the werewolf, and there's this big head that comes in, right? And she looks up, and but then you have to cut, because if it comes in any further, you're going to see that it's a guy holding, the head.
We went through the budget and finished the film, and we had no photography of werewolves. By the time the film was, basically the story was in the can, there was shots of basically a guy in a bear suit in the dark, and that was it. And they took the film standing on its own without the effects and showed it to the powers that be, and on the basis of that, they got the additional money to let Rob do the work that he had to do. But we had the whole film done with no werewolves, which was, a little lacking, I guess.
We had to go back to Embassy and say, listen, if you give us a couple of more bucks, we can probably do better than this. And so that whole scene where she's killed by the werewolf was done rather perfunctorily originally, with these werewolf heads and hands.
Actually, it was 3 months between shooting the movie and then they finished the werewolf, and we came back 3 months later to do all the interaction with the werewolf after it was finished. And I said to Gigi, the hairdresser, my hair's longer. You should trim it. She said, no, it's the same. I said, no, it's longer. Well, if you watch the movie, you can tell what was shot when, because my hair goes all through the movie. It's literally longer in all the shots with the werewolf.
I do remember one day being very glum when they put it was the big makeup day, and I think it was maybe the acid face where they had burned half my face off. And I'm sitting in the hallway after my 6.5-hour makeup session, ready to shoot, looking very despondent, like, oh gosh, trained at Yale, 2 leading roles on Broadway, my first movie in California, my face is melted off in a low-budget movie. And I'm sitting there with that look on my face, and Dennis Dugan comes up to me and says, "Bob, next time, read the whole script."
Pino Donaggio, who had also scored Piranha for Joe, and he was an Italian composer, did not speak English. The way that we scored that movie, because we had very little money, was that, and I've never done it this way since, thank God, but we flew him over from Italy, sat down at the Moviola and spotted the movie, so, you know, and we had actually Paul Bartel, who's a director and a friend of ours, speak Spanish, and Pino speaks Spanish, and so they would speak Spanish at each other, which of course it's not their first language, so it was kind of a translation of a translation, but managed to get through it. And then Pino went back to Italy and recorded the score, and mailed it to us, and that was it.
When I went to cut it in, I think I left one cue out. I lost one. I mean, they came in little rolls, and I was in there putting, on the Moviola, putting them together, and I got to cue number 47 or whatever, and I couldn't find it. I don't know where it went. I don't know where it got to. I don't know what happened to it. So I had to substitute another piece of music at the end, and I think Pino was a little annoyed, and as was I, because the music was much better that was actually written for the part.
Margaret, look at me. I trusted you, Karen.
We were in the looping stage, and Joe said,
Yeah, we got a kind of a dead spot right before you pull the thing out of your brain.
and I said, "Well, what do you want me to do?" He says, "Well, what would you say right before you pull something out of your, you pull a bullet out of your head? What would you say before?" And I go, I don't know. And then I said, "I want to give you a piece of my mind," as a joke, expecting him to laugh. He goes, "Okay, do that," which is how so many of Joe's classic moments come about. He goes, "All right, do it."
I want to give you a piece of my mind.
Of course, you won't be using you'll be dubbing my Joe Dante impression with his real voice, right? So he won't have to hear this. "Joe, you know I love you." But he does an impression of me, which is equally insulting, so why should I worry?
Well, the nice thing about making a horror picture for me as my first pictures was that I didn't have to do any research. I didn't have to do any homework. I had spent my whole life watching these kind of pictures. I knew what I liked about them. I knew what I didn't like about them. I knew what worked and what didn't work, and that I had a lot of affection for them. And I tried to get that affection to come out off the screen toward the audience. And so there's a lot of nods in those pictures to earlier movies.
Joe is one of the first directors, movie brat directors who knows so many movies that it's effortless for him to refer to them in his work and to make them a constant source of added enjoyment for a knowledgeable moviegoer. However, his films are completely enjoyable by the 15-year-old who doesn't get any of the references.
Joe loves movies. He absolutely loves movies. I mean, you can't go to his house without him sitting you down and showing you a screening of something or another.
You were enthused by his enthusiasm for the material.
I find it interesting to comment on the movie within the movie. I mean, while you're watching it, so that you get the experience of watching the movie, but you also get a sort of an editorial judgment on what the filmmakers think of the movie and the material and the movies that have gone before. And
I think he takes the old movies and adds the humor to it. And I think that's what makes him so unique and wonderful.
Almost every character in the movie is named after a director of a werewolf movie. George Wagner with the Patrick Macnee character, and the head of the TV station, played by Kevin McCarthy, is Freddie Francis. And Lou Landers is the anchorman, and the John Carradine character is Earl Kenton. So yeah, it was a real inside kind of thing.
I'll get our people to cruise west of.
Boy, there's a lot of flotsam and jetsam out tonight, isn't there?
Seems like there's more of them every time we get out here.
we sort of decided to make the picture look like it was an urban crime movie for the first part, and in fact got the distributor, Avco Embassy, to sort of soft pedal the werewolf stuff in the advertising to make it look more like a slasher movie, which were actually pretty popular at the time. And the part of the fun was that people really didn't know it was a werewolf movie for the first couple of weeks when it came out, and it was a surprise. It's a hit. It certainly surprised me.
I will never forget the screening of The Howling. I sat there in shock at the audience that went like a roller coaster. laughing, screaming, all the way through the entire movie. And I was in shock. I had never witnessed an audience interaction like that.
I went to the preview